Well, I had a chance to check out Here Comes the Sun, the Beatles tune that was put up by our Target member, Web TV Dan. And Dan, your hand position is great. I love what you're doing with your right hand. Doing a really good job of keeping it just in perfect position. Left hand's looking really good too, so your hand position is great. And the only thing, when you're doing a finger picking song like this, you've got a good feel on the D chord for the alternating bass, and sometimes on the G's and the A's, though, you end up hitting the same bass string a few. You may already know this by now, but that sometimes you end up hitting the same bass string a few times in a row. Now, one thing you can do to help that is when you're finger picking a piece, you're hearing there are two things going on. There are bass notes over here on the left hand on the piano, and there are melody notes over here. And if you're really focused on the melody notes, I kind of believe you can only really be listening consciously to one part at a time, the bass or the melody or the sum of it. Now, if you're listening to the sum, it's hard to discern if something goes wrong with one part or another. So I'm not even going to go too far into that. But most of the time, you're listening to the melody because that's the part you're most familiar with. And if you're listening to the melody consciously, you can be subconsciously listening to the bass. But if a mistake happens in the bass, the subconscious part of your brain is not going to register it as much as the conscious part will. Now, see if I can clear this all up. If you're listening to the bass consciously and something goes wrong in the melody, you will hear that subconsciously. But if you're listening to the melody, the bass is not as well defined, and if something goes wrong in the bass and you're trying to listen to that part subconsciously, you're not going to hear it as much. So the key to this is then forget about the melody. Practice playing through it, and all you're thinking about is the bass notes. All I'm listening for is that. And I don't care what's going on in the melody. Just pay attention to that. See if you can hear that I'm doing this and not this. Because especially when it comes to a measure like this, there's a lot of action going on in the melody right there, and that makes it really easy to forget about the bass and not get it like this, but for something like this to happen. 3 bass notes in a row that turn out to be the same. So put a little extra brain power in on what's happening in the bass, and then that'll all work. One last thing, you got to count really, really carefully in the odd part. The part when this happens, your brain wants to start that F chord on a beat. It's not. It starts on an and. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So you got to make sure that you rush. I hate to ever use the word rush, but you can't play that last note as a quarter note. It needs to be. So that part is really tricky because of the odd time signature that happens right there. So just work on counting in there, slow it down a little bit. Like I say to everybody about everything, slow it down a little bit more and just be a little more conscious of what you're doing, especially just pay attention to the bass notes. But otherwise, really, really good job. Hey, a quick comment on, I saw a little bit of your Over the Rainbow as well too, and I just want to say one thing about it. When you have some of those runs in there, make sure you don't rush into the next measure. A lot of times there's spots where you cut a measure short by putting a little run in there, and all of a sudden you're into the next measure a little too early, similar to what was happening here in, actually no, this wasn't happening in Here Comes the Sun, and this one you're stretching a few notes out, but anyhow, great work.